a bunch of American colonists dressed up like Native Americans and snuck onto 3 British ships in Boston Harbor. They then proceeded to dump 92,000 pounds of tea into the water, an act of defiance that would come to be known as the Boston Tea Party. But why did they do it? Well, to put it simply, the colonists were mad as hell, and they had every right to be. For years, the British government had been exploiting its North American colonies for their own economic gain. The colonists were treated as second-class citizens without the same rights or privileges as those living in Britain. And they had no voice in the decisions that affected their lives. But things came to a head with the Tea Act of 1773, which gave the British East India Company a monopoly on tea sales in the colonies. This meant that the colonists would no longer be able to buy tea from other merchants at lower prices. No, sir, they'd be forced to purchase their tea from the British East India Company at higher prices. And if they didn't, they'd be heavily penalized. It was a classic example of British tyranny, and the colonists weren't having it. In the run-up to the Boston Tea Party, tensions were already high between the colonists and the British authorities. In 1770, British soldiers had fired on a crowd of unarmed protesters in Boston, killing 5 people. And in 1773, the British Parliament had passed a series of laws known as the Intolerable Acts, which were designed to punish the colony of Massachusetts for its role in the Boston Massacre. The colonists saw the Tea Act as just another example of British oppression, and they were determined to resist. On December 16, 1773, a group of colonists met in secret and decided to take matters into their own hands. They would disguise themselves as Native Americans and sneak onto the 3 British ships docked in Boston Harbor, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver. They would then dump the tea into the harbor and send a clear message to the British government. They were not going to be bullied or oppressed any longer. The plan was simple, but it took a lot of coordination and courage. The men had to be careful not to be seen by the British soldiers guarding the ships. If they were caught, they could be arrested or even killed. But they were willing to take the risk because they knew that they were fighting for a greater cause. In the early hours of December, the men set out from a secret meeting place and made their way to the docks. They had donned their disguises and were now ready to carry out their mission. The first 2 ships, the Dartmouth and the Eleanor, were carrying chests of tea, while the Beaver was carrying other cargo. But the men knew that they only had one chance to make this work. They needed to destroy as much tea as possible to send a strong message to the British. As they worked quickly but carefully, unloading the chests of tea and dumping them into the sea, some of the men began to chant, "No taxation without representation." Their voices echoed across the silent harbor, a powerful symbol of their defiance. And then it was done. As the first rays of sunlight began to peek over the horizon, the men had finished their mission. They had dumped more than 92,000 pounds of tea into Boston Harbor. It was a stunning act of courage and defiance that would send shockwaves throughout the colonies and Britain. News of the Boston Tea Party spread like wildfire, and colonists from other areas began to plan their own acts of resistance. The British government, for their part, was furious. They saw the Tea Party as a direct challenge to their authority, and they responded with even more oppressive measures. But the colonists were undeterred. They had tasted freedom, and they were not about to give it up. Today, the Boston Tea Party is remembered as one of the most important events leading up to the American Revolution. It was a pivotal moment in the struggle for independence, a time when ordinary people stood up to tyranny and won. And though the fight for freedom was far from over, the colonists knew that they had taken an important step towards creating a new nation, a nation built on the principles of liberty and democracy. Hey, thanks for watching. I'm your host. If you want to learn more about the American Revolution, stay tuned for more information. And remember, you can help us keep this channel running by becoming a member.